I'd like to welcome everyone with us at today's webinar. The topic of today is COVID-19 disinformation and the global battle of narratives, and we are going to discuss EU and US perspectives. It is my pleasure to have distinguished panelists today. My name is Naja Kovalcikova, and I'm the Program Manager and Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And I have three main speakers, but also our co-organizer from the European Parliament Liaison Office. First, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Naja Bentzen. Naja is a policy analyst at the European Parliament Research Service. She is focusing on issues related to disinformation, but is also expert on Eastern partnerships and the Arctic. Welcome, Naja. Second, we have with us today Laura Rosenberger, who is the director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy and a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And she's focusing on foreign authoritarian interference in democracies. Welcome, Laura. And third, we have with us the Dutch member of the European Parliament, Sophie in Veld, who is, besides other functions, also a chair of the committee, of the LIBE committee, monitoring group on democracy, rule of law, and the fundamental rights, and is experienced on all the issues related to democracy, privacy, and freedom of speech. Welcome, Sophie. And last but not least, I would like to welcome with us also the director of the European Parliament Liaison Office based in Washington, DC, Mr. Joseph Dunn, and I will give him an opening word as well before we proceed further.
Thank you very much, Nadia. I'm not going to take up any time because this is such a short session. I'm very happy as the director of the European Parliament Liaison Office in Washington, the only external office of the Parliament to do this with the GMF. GMF is a strong and close partner of ours. We work together, and I say that not only because I've previously been a fellow at the GMF, but we do in every day, as this event shows, we work very closely together. And I'm very happy that we have a leading member of the Parliament and a researcher from our research service to give the EP and EU perspective on what's really a central issue of our time. So over to the panelists, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much and welcome to be here with us today. So I would start to bring a bit of a context to our conversation as we are currently facing the global health pandemic. We have all noticed that it has been aggravated by the global battle of narratives. Various countries have taken various measures, more or less effective. We are going to discuss mostly the measures and the responses of the EU and US and the transatlantic cooperation on fighting COVID-19 disinformation. We have witnessed also different approaches of the European institutions. We are awaiting two major policies coming out shortly that will help counter disinformation efforts. One of them is Digital Services Act, and the second one is the European Democracy Action Plan, where one of the key three areas will be focusing on combating disinformation. Naja, as a representative of the European Parliament Research Service, I'd like you to start perhaps with providing us a big picture of what has been happening during the global battle of narratives in the COVID-19 crisis. What are the key developments in Europe that you have been monitoring? And perhaps if you could enlighten us about your recent projects and the way forward that you plan to do within your work.
Thank you, Nadia. And thank you to the German Marshall Fund and to Joe Dunn and the European Parliament's Liaison Office for organizing the webinar and for inviting me. I'm Naja Bentzen. I'm a policy analyst in the European Parliamentary Research Service. And I'll start by zooming out and looking more broadly at the ongoing battle of narratives and competition between authoritarianism and liberal democracy that has been further fueled by the pandemic. Then I will zoom in on some of the key related issues that we partly covered in three recent EPRS briefings on, firstly, the global battle of narratives during the pandemic, secondly, on the health infodemic, and thirdly, on the impact of the pandemic on media freedom across the world. And regarding these briefings, I want to thank my colleague Thomas Smith, who has been working with me on the latter two briefings. So very generally, crises often accelerate already existing trends. And this is what we are observing right now. And this is also a common denominator in these briefings. we are seeing that fear, anxiety, and isolation are further fueling polarization and providing fertile ground for the spread of mis- and disinformation, including viral conspiracy theories. This is happening against the backdrop of increasing geopolitical tension that has also become increasingly visible during the pandemic. The battle of narratives that the EU High Representative Borrell referred to in March is the tip of the iceberg. The pandemic seems to be not only a litmus test for healthcare systems around the world, but a global competition on which country has the best political system. Both Moscow and Beijing are trying to demonstrate that their authoritarian systems are better at dealing with the crisis than liberal democratic systems. The stakes are sky high, not least for actors who have failed to respond adequately and in a timely manner. Facts, statistics, and trust have become further politicized. The more a government has to sweep under the carpet, so to speak, the greater the length it will go to and has to go to in order to control the narrative. The more aggressive its information campaigns will be, and the more pressure it will exert on media. So these efforts include the Chinese Communist Party more openly increasing its pressure on European governments to get its way, to defend Beijing's narratives and global image. It also includes the Kremlin's efforts to amplify already existing divisions and weaponize wedge issues, and some of these efforts could potentially pave the way for wider influence in the wake of the crisis. Disinformation or twisted narratives to undermine trust in authorities in democracies, including in the European Union, have been combined with heavily promoted health diplomacy echoed by local proxies in Europe. One case in point is Serbia's president, who in March kissed the Chinese flag and praised China for its medical assistance and called the Chinese president a true friend of the Serbian people, accused the EU of hypocrisy, and called European solidarity a fairy tale. This dramatic performance was immediately disseminated by Chinese state media targeting Western audiences. What he forgot to mention was that the EU has invested heavily in modernizing Serbia's health sector over the past 20 years, and that Serbia, which is a candidate country for EU membership, could benefit from the EU stockpile of medical equipment. The EU's 93 million euros aid package just for Serbia includes 15 million for medical equipment. And if we zoom in on some of the key aspects of the evolving battle of narratives, I will mention three. Firstly, the impact on media freedom. Secondly, the role of online platforms. And thirdly, the role of verified information and science. So firstly, the global infodemic that has accompanied the pandemic has sparked increased efforts to combat disinformation and misinformation campaigns on the virus. Free media is a vital part of democracy, while authoritarian systems, on the other hand, rely on controlling and suppressing information and media. And there was increasing pressure on media freedom even before the crisis, but media freedom watchdogs such as Reporters Without Borders and the Council of Europe's platform to promote the protection of journalism have voiced concern that political leaders in many countries are using the crisis to justify further restrictions on media freedom, and you can read more about this in our briefing. Secondly, freedom of expression is of course interlinked with access to information. This takes us to the role of the online platforms. We already saw before the pandemic that ad revenue for traditional news media outlets was absorbed by leading online platforms, and that the business models of these platforms tend to favor attention-grabbing and polarizing content. And the crisis has made it even clearer that firstly, the role of the tech companies cannot be overestimated. Secondly, that there is a fundamental mismatch between the business models and the private profits of the online platforms on the one side, and the public interest, the democratic debate on the other side. So thirdly, to end on a positive note, working for the European Parliamentary Research Service, I may be biased in favor of facts, but there is evidence that in some countries that public trust in science is increasing. The proportion of Germans who said that they trust science and research wholeheartedly increased to 36% in April, which is 4 times more than the same survey in 2019 showed. Another 37% said that they were likely to trust science and research. So in total, that's almost 3 out of 4 people who trust science and research in Germany. In a UK poll, nearly 2/3 said the pandemic had made them more likely to listen to expert advice from qualified scientists and researchers. Pew Research Center has also published a survey saying that Americans' confidence in medical scientists has grown since the coronavirus outbreak, and here respondents were divided across party line. This increasing focus on verified information was also reflected in the European Parliament's resolution from April, which called for a European information source providing verified, reliable content to citizens in the context of the pandemic. So just to summarize, the current crisis has accelerated already existing trends, including a competition between authoritarianism and liberal democracy. Linked to this, there is growing pressure on media freedom. There is increasing focus on the role of big tech in our info sphere, and there is evidence of growing public trust in scientific expertise in some countries.
Thank you very much, Naja, and especially highlighting the importance of continuity of the efforts that now are being undermined on the democratic side by other actors, especially the trust in science. And I'd like to follow up on this because it's not only in science, it's in democracy, in democratic institutions in general, as well as the politicization of this health crisis. And I would like to proceed to you, Laura, on this issue of how especially Russia and China, that Naja also mentioned, have been extremely active during this pandemic to trying to undermine the trust in democracies and their capacity to counter or tackle the challenges we are all facing now. How have they been trying to do that? And what has been the response of the United States, of the EU, of the transatlantic partnership to this, and what could be done better or more? Over to you.
Thanks so much, Nadia, and thanks to our partners at the European Parliament office in Washington for joining us and hosting this event today. And it's so wonderful to be alongside my co-panelists and my colleagues here to have this conversation. I want to pick up really on a piece that I think is so important in how Naja framed this, which is that all of this global battle of narratives is happening in this much broader emerging contest between authoritarianism and democracy. I think when we talk about disinformation or information operations, we often tend to do so in very tactical terms. And we tend to look at these discrete operations and particular narratives or particular covert activities. But I think it's really important to take that step back that Naja really did there, to put this in the broader frame that the information space is emerging as a key domain of battle, really, if authoritarians have their way, in this competition between authoritarianism and democracy. And I'll just be a little bit wonky for 1 second to note that this is a bit of an asymmetric battle space. The very definition of it as a battle space and information as weapons is something that's much more inherently favorable to authoritarians who see information as something to be controlled and something to be manipulated, and really as something that rests with the state. Whereas democracies value free and open information, and that free and open exchange is really critical to the function of deliberative democracy and to people's faith in democratic institutions. And so I think it's really important as we talk about, what we're seeing in information operations around particular events, that we understand it in that broader frame. And the only other point I would make in that broad context is that while we often tend to focus on the narratives and the messaging, I think it's really important to understand that this is a contest where it's not just about the content that's being transmitted. It's about which systems of government are going to have more control over information infrastructure that actually transmits that information and that allows for the collection of data off of that information. It may seem like the 5G discussion and Huawei is not related to when we're talking about information operations, but I'd argue that it very much is. And then it's about governance of information. And while I won't get into that today, I do think it's really important that we understand that this is a much bigger contest about if information is going to allow to continue to be able to flow freely, and to have quality information and trustworthy information really flow to the top, or if it's going to be a future where authoritarians essentially get to sort of set the reality for their citizens. So let me just then turn to the questions, Nad'a, that you posed in that context about what China and Russia in particular are doing in the COVID context with information, and what we are and should be doing about it. So briefly, as Naja already kind of laid out, China's main effort has been to deflect blame from itself for its own failings in its initial handling of the virus, and to advance the idea of China as a partner of first resort for other countries, and China's model as one that is superior to the democratic model. A lot of this has happened around the aid and assistance that's been provided and the narratives accompanying it. The Serbia story that Naja told is just one of many. It's one of the most egregious examples, but we've been tracking this aid across the European continent, and it's been quite significant in the way that that China and its constituent parts, in some cases harnessing Chinese, state-connected organizations and quote-unquote private entities to engage in some of this activity as well. The messaging around that hasn't just been positive. It's often been coercive, trying to push governments and officials to make certain kinds of statements, often written by Chinese officials, about Chinese aid and assistance, and also to suppress, either the acquisition of aid from Taiwan or other places, or to coerce governments into not thanking Taiwan for when they have received aid from them. So some of the messaging that we see from Beijing on this is implicit, essentially just lifting up China as a partner and a real model for others to look to, especially in a lot of its messaging from its embassies in Europe and from its state media outlets that are based in Europe. But from spokespeople in Beijing, we've seen a much more sharply critical, explicit message that China's helping because the US didn't show up. Really trying to more explicitly drive a wedge here between Europe and the United States, and to say, in fact, it's China who's the better partner. There's one notable exception to the primarily more positive message we've seen from, or implicit messaging we've seen from European embassies, Chinese embassies in Europe, and that's its embassy in Paris, which has had some very, very assertive commentary, including one statement that they posted that explicitly said, the US is so quick to criticize China's dictatorship, but look how the United States, the beacon of democracy, is absolutely failing. It's China's dictatorship that's actually prevailing. So very explicit in the in the belief that China's model is really the superior one. A lot of this hasn't necessarily been disinformation. It's been certain kinds of narratives that have tried to push a particular angle, but we have seen Chinese entities pushing certain kinds of disinformation, particularly about the origin of the virus. We've seen multiple conflicting narratives being pushed about where that virus originated. And the other thing I'll point to that I think is notable is that we've seen an increasing convergence and essentially circular amplification effort emerging between Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran in a lot of their narratives and content and conspiracy theories about the virus. And in particular, a lot of that is really anti-American. And so I think the last point I'd say on the China piece is that while oftentimes we tend to think about, when we see things in the English language, we think it's aimed at the US or maybe at Europeans, but I'd argue that a lot of this messaging is actually aimed at other parts of the world, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, where some of that anti-American messaging may have a little bit more resonance. Russia, really briefly, has also been engaging in some of this conspiratorial content, as Naja mentioned, continuing on with its typical efforts to try to divide allies from one another. But in some ways, Russia's sort of been drafting off of Beijing's efforts, and I think that they've been a little bit content to let China take the much more aggressive lead. briefly on what we should be doing about this, and we can, you know, talk longer about this in Q&A. But number one, I think that the statements that we've seen from High Representative Borrell, from President Macron, from NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, calling out explicitly what we're seeing in the information space, in particular from Beijing, has been very important. But of course, we've also seen the effectiveness that pressure from the CCP can have in terms of suppressing efforts to call that out, whether that's in terms of questions about what happened with the European External Action Service report a couple weeks ago, or the op-ed that had some content censored in it that ran in the China Daily. So to push back on those much more coercive efforts, I think the first thing we need to do is, you know, democratic allies need to stand together. And this sounds like a throwaway point, but in fact, I think it's critical. Going back to that context of this being a larger contest between authoritarians and democracies, democracies have got to stand together and reinforce one another's efforts. So we have to resist their efforts, the authoritarian efforts to divide us, number one. Number two, we have to focus on truth and transparency in our own messaging. Naja hit on this as well, how some of our own failures really create vulnerabilities here. You know, when leaders in democratic countries weaponize information themselves, they're playing directly into authoritarians' hands. So truth and transparency in our own messaging also has to be an essential part of this. And then while I think that the instinct is often to focus on how to counter disinformation or counter information operations, one of the most important things that we could be doing is actually focusing on an affirmative information strategy that puts quality information from trusted messengers out there in order to prevent the formation of information voids or to allow some of these particular efforts to take root. So that's just a few top line points on what we need to be doing, but I really look forward to the discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Laura. And I would like to build on your points, actually, which are a very good transition to Sophie's expertise and activity, and actually the space of the democracy versus authoritarianism and the impact on democracy that this crisis has had, or the measures that have been taken during COVID-19. And also, if you could touch upon a little bit how these efforts and measures have been abused by authoritarian rulers, and what does that mean for our democracy? Over to you, Sophie.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope that I don't know if I'm going to actually shed light on the whole situation, because I think it's incredibly complex. Already listening to the two excellent previous introductions. I mean, we're talking about, for example, driving a wedge between democracies, but you know, who the good guys are, the democracies and the bad guys, is not so clear anymore. It used to be very clear, the Americans and the Europeans were the good guys, and the Chinese and all the others were the bad guys. Well, that's not so simple anymore. And when you're talking about anti-Americanism, for example, well, I'm afraid that this US administration is making it very easy. You know, they are more anti-American than some anti-Americans outside the US, I would say. But I think if I look at the title of this webinar, The Battle of Narratives, it's actually a battle for power. I think Naja said it, or Naja said it at the start, because, you know, fake news or disinformation or malinformation, whatever you call it, is nothing new. It's always been around. There've always been, you know, conspiracy theories and fake stories, and it may have been intentional or unintentional. I mean, where does fake news end and politics start? Or, you know, I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but there are a lot of things that some people believe, which other people do not believe. Let me remain very polite. So that's nothing new. But the use of new technologies to spread news and to actually indeed use it as a weapon to, in particular, stoke up fears, divisions, and uncertainty. That is, I think, new. And I think what is typical for the European Union, if you compare it to the other countries that have been mentioned, is that this is all about politics and it's about power. And the European Union is very bad at politics and about power. We like technocratic things. We like to make rules. That's what we're very good at. But when it's about politics and power, we get incredibly nervous because we don't know how to handle it. You know, the European Union was not built for power, but we are increasingly pushed into a position where we have to deal with these issues, and we have to become a power. We have to become a global power. Otherwise, you know, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. That's a little bit the situation we're in right now, and it's very clear that some of those outside forces pushing fake news, they are clearly out to, well, divide and rule. You know, it's a very old principle, but it still works, and they're really trying to play the European Union apart. And of course, some of the let's say accepted authorities are part of that. I only need to mention, for example, Viktor Orban, you know, who is a major source of fake news. But he has now used this pandemic to introduce legislation criminalizing fake news. But it's the government deciding what is fake news. I mean, you know, that's not a democracy anymore. That's why I say this old division between the democratic world and the non-democratic world is not so clear cut anymore. And that's also the problem. The European Union, again, we're taking all these measures, and we have these Stratcom, and we're asking the big platforms to filter out fake news. But again, that's all very, very technocratic. As long as we are afraid to say, Mr. Orban, you're a member of this club, and you yourself are using fake news as a political weapon, or when we're afraid to say to our allies, like President Trump, for example, you know, dear Donald, you know, you're talking a lot of nonsense. You're spreading fake news, and your allies, your political allies, with your support, are spreading fake news, making people confused, not knowing whom to trust anymore. And trust is, of course, a key issue here, because the question is not just the message, it's also, and maybe even more, the messenger. Because we also have to ask ourselves, I mean, some of these stories are such blatant nonsense that you ask yourself, why do people believe that? You know, why are they so susceptible to this kind of nonsense? All the conspiracy theories and what have you. Clearly, we have an issue with trust in the real authorities. Trust in science, trust in parliamentary democracy, or in democracy tout court, trust in mainstream media, and I think to a degree politicians are guilty of that as well. We've been bashing, you know, under pressure of the rising populist forces. A lot of mainstream political parties have started to bash parliamentary democracy and science as well. You know, they presented themselves as being kind of extra parliamentary, saying, oh, don't trust politicians. But in doing that, they have undermined trust in representative democracy. And now, you know, we turn around and we find that people don't trust politicians anymore. Well, I suppose, you know, they've never fully trusted politicians anyway, but at least up to a certain point. But that trust has been very, very severely eroded. I also think if we want a counter narrative that people are going to accept, it's not enough to have a website, you know, presenting all the facts, because people are not going to look at it, they're not going to trust it. I mean, if you look at information about the European Union in general, I mean, I've been working in the institutions for over 25 years now. It's really funny to see, you know, how much of an effort it has always been put into making available information about the EU institutions, and how little people actually make use of those channels. They get their information elsewhere, and I think what we certainly need to do is stop weakening reliable sources. For example, we see that mainstream media, whether they're left wing or right wing, I don't care, have been severely weakened because in some member states, like Hungary, like Poland, but also some other member states, they have been under massive pressure of the government, public media have been severely underfunded or harassed, intimidated. We see the economic impact of the pandemic on small independent media outlets and journalists is devastating, and that's why, you know, my group has called for the creation of an emergency fund, emergency aid for independent media to maintain at least the pluralism of the media landscape. I think the same goes for science. We need to give that a lot more support, and also again stop bashing the EU institutions, because we just make ourselves incredibly vulnerable to all these outside and inside attacks. And I think ultimately, do we need to filter out and label disinformation and fake news? Yes. Do we need to provide a counter narrative, and do we need to provide the facts? Yes, but that in itself, I think, is not going to be enough. If we are afraid to point out that there are authorities like governments and like government leaders who are themselves guilty of spreading fake news deliberately to undermine the European Union, and if we are not willing to give support to, as I said, the mainstream media, science, and also for politicians to show that they put their trust in science. And I think that's definitely something, a kind of unintended benefit of this crisis, that scientists are, we've started to reappreciate their expertise. I think this is pretty much what I wanted to say. Yeah, no, maybe one last thing, because we're all talking about fake news and disinformation. Can we start by getting a legal definition of that? I mean, what is fake news? Who determines what is fake news or disinformation? And if we really want to take any measures, then we need to have a proper definition of that, because I'm a little bit worried about freedom of speech and freedom of the media. If I look at how easily we are making commercial entities, even non-European commercial entities, responsible for determining what we as European citizens receive as information or not. I find that pretty scary. I find that undemocratic. And if we're going to go down that avenue, then we need a proper definition of what fake news or disinformation or malinformation is. Okay, I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you. I already have so many questions, and we are receiving questions also from our audience. So I'll maybe just try to follow up first on what you mentioned about the increased trust which is needed, because it's currently eroded. And also, it's not enough to just feed with our own information, which is factual and accurate. And I would like to then give word to Naja, because I know you have been working a lot on resilience building and how can we increase the role of facts in the infodemic. Could you perhaps share some views on that? And maybe even touch upon collective cognitive resilience that you have been working on recently. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia, and thank you to Laura and Sophie for your excellent points. And maybe in this context, I can also pick up on Laura's point about avoiding information voids, and Sophie's point about not weakening quality information sources, because that actually ties in with this. Looking from the EU perspective, of course, we need to communicate our values and interests and achievements better. That is clear. But we also have to more broadly boost our, what I like to call our collective cognitive resilience. So over the past few years, the EU has been increasing the pressure on online platforms to take responsibility for limiting the spread of mis and disinformation. And Nadia, you mentioned two key next steps, the Digital Services Act and the EU Democracy Plan. So in 2018, just for background, the EU asked platforms to increase the findability and visibility of verified information. And if we go back to the current pandemic, the platforms cooperation with WHO and national health authorities appears to be working better than cooperation to counter political disinformation. Of course, there are many flaws and a lot of criticism, but at least they have been able to highlight verified information. And I think it has been easier to increase this findability and visibility, because this kind of information has actually been available via WHO and national health authorities. At the same time, we also know that known conspiracy theories promoting websites have seen more traffic than these sources. In the context of the corona crisis, the European Parliament, as I mentioned before, adopted a resolution calling for a European information source providing verified, reliable content to citizens. And this was related to the pandemic. But we all know that other crises will arise and other wedge issues related to history, politics, culture, society, and religion will be weaponized in the future. We have to prepare for future infodemics. Vera Jourova said last week that we are committed to not responding to propaganda by using the same language. Facts and evidence must be available, and this includes, of course, information about the EU's financial, technical, and medical support, both in and beyond the EU. But if we want people to be able to check facts themselves, we need to boost the information ecosystem, which will be even more fragile post-COVID, as Sophie also mentioned. And in addition to increased support for media freedom and plurality, quality journalism, we have to make sure that everyone can access verified, trustworthy information in their mother tongues. We need to make sure that people don't lack basic ingredients in their information diet, so to speak. And here I think that national governments and the EU can provide funds for the creation or the maintenance or updating of independent, verified online encyclopedias in people's mother tongue. Some exist already, for example, in Norway and Latvia, while others were struggling to survive even pre-COVID. So this is part of our information ecosystem, but it has currently not received too much attention. So maybe this is a good opportunity to increase the attention, especially in a situation where people are very worried about disinformation, and at the same time, as we mentioned, that there is increasing trust in science.
Thank you very much, Naja. And I'm trying to go through the questions and select a few, since we do not have much time. So I would like to move back to the transatlantic bond and the ties, and we'll combine a couple of questions, and would like Laura to perhaps start, and both Naja and Sophie are welcome to answer from the EU side. There's a question about vulnerability of the EU and US, and if there is a difference, is US more vulnerable to disinformation or foreign interference? And the suggestion here is about leading mainstream national media lacking in the US. And is this perhaps an opportunity, this crisis, to increase the cooperation between the US and EU on fighting against disinformation?
Well, thank you. It's a great question. And I guess I would say I wish it could be, and I hope it would be. But I want to pick up on a point that Sophie made, which, you know, unfortunately I agree with, which is that the current US administration is in many ways not hewing to the democratic values and principles that are so critical to actually taking on the authoritarian strategies that we're facing. Sophie, I will just note your characterization that some officials in the US are more anti-American than the anti-Americans, and I will just note that. But I think that, you know, we do face a real challenge here in this moment, because this should be a real moment of unity between the US and Europe in fighting this pandemic. And frankly, more broadly, you know, I mean, a pandemic by definition is global, and it requires multilateral solutions. And so when we have things like the administration refusing to sign on to a G7 statement because the term Wuhan virus couldn't be agreed to by other parties. That is just a self-inflicted wound, preventing the kind of unity that we should be really having in the face of this challenge. Now, I do think, though, that it's really important, and I know the temptation from particularly the European perspective is to equate the current administration with the United States, and I would really ask that people not do that. And I know it's hard because that's what sort of fills the airwaves and fills the headlines. But there are so many people in the United States, including, frankly, in the current administration, but also in particular in Congress, who believe deeply, deeply in the importance of the transatlantic alliance, who believe deeply in working with our democratic partners and allies, and who know that this is essential to not only dealing with the pandemic, but to dealing with the challenges of authoritarianism that are coming, being accelerated, frankly, in this moment. And so, and then, some of the polling that was mentioned in the conversations as well has also shown, real support in the US for democracy, for working with our partners and allies. And I'm certainly hopeful that we can get back to a place soon where that is the front and center in our efforts. That being said, and given the challenges of the moment being real, I do think that, with many people who are very focused on building these kinds of cooperative approaches, including across the Atlantic, that there is potential, even given the limitations that we face, to be doing more. It may be in more sort of non-conventional kinds of approaches, more cooperation between the private sector, more cooperation between civil society, other kinds of non-traditional ways that I do think are so important in this moment. Really briefly on the question of vulnerabilities, I mean, this is a complicated question, and we could, it's hard to say even, is the EU monolithic in terms of its vulnerabilities? It's not, right? There's so many different contexts within that, and that came up a bit in the discussion here. If we take a place like Hungary, obviously very different than a place like the Netherlands, for instance. But I do think, I'll just speak to the United States. I'm very worried by our own vulnerabilities, not just in the media, the fractured media ecosystem that you mentioned, but our polarization and our division is one of the biggest vulnerabilities that we face to these kinds of challenges. And, we are on this accelerating slope where it seems truth is increasingly seen as a relative concept. And that's so destructive to the entire function of democracy and makes us so much more vulnerable to these kind of authoritarian approaches that we're seeing in the information space. We really, really, really need to double down on investing in our democratic institutions and investing in the kinds of quality information that Naja was highlighting if we're going to reverse that trend.
Talking about democratic institutions, Sophie, I would like to come back to you and think a little bit about some good examples, some good practices or responses that either you could share with us from Netherlands. Netherlands is actually considered one of the countries that has been implementing good measures to counter disinformation and restructuring a little bit their system, more or less. But there are also a lot of, or some efforts in the European Parliament that have been undertaken recently to encourage to deal with disinformation, to raise the awareness of the foreign authoritarian interference in Europe. And even you yourself, you have signed a letter that asked the EAS to speak up about the importance of defending our democracy and the democratic discourse and the freedom of sharing facts. Could you perhaps elaborate a little bit on that, and what role do you see of the members of the European Parliament, the European Parliament in general, to help counter disinformation?
Well, let me first state clearly, I neither speak for my country nor for the whole European Parliament. As a matter of fact, on the whole, I tend to be slightly more skeptical than the average member of the European Parliament about all these efforts, because no matter how many facts we make available, facts and the truth are seen to be elitist by some people. And that's the problem. They just do not trust the source. you know, and they're going to reject whatever you say. I remember, it has nothing to do with the pandemic, but in 2005, when in the Netherlands we had a referendum about the constitutional treaty for the EU, I remember some of the opponents on a debating panel on the campaign trail, they argued that if you vote for this constitutional treaty, then they're going to reintroduce the death penalty. And you know, it even made me laugh because it was just such a ridiculous claim. And then I said, okay, so where does it say in the treaty that, you know, the death penalty will be reintroduced? And they said, oh no, but it's not in the treaty, but it's secret. It's secret. And yeah, I thought it was ridiculous, but people believed it, and I could, you know, no matter what I did, people would believe that kind of nonsense, and that's the real issue. It's not that we don't have the facts. And when I, you know, responding to Laura, of course, the United States is much more than Trump or the Trump administration. I know that, fortunately. I mean, I think it's a great country. Some people think I'm anti-American. It's the opposite, you know. I think it's a fantastic country. I grew up believing that everything that was new and great and fantastic was American. Coming from America was like saying this is the best. The point is, of course, that if you're the president of the United States, then you have a kind of authority that somebody else may not have. That's the point, you know. So his voice carries a lot more weight than that of a lot of other sensible people. And again, this issue of the people versus the elite plays a big role, and that is what we have to overcome. And we're not going to overcome that issue by presenting more facts and more reports and having a website and et cetera, et cetera. Then I also think, should the transatlantic alliance be strengthened in the fight against disinformation? Well, that's not a bad thing. But I think we have seen that neither the US nor the European Union are monolithic in this respect. And I do believe that there are probably a lot of people in China, in Africa, in Iran, who would want to be a part of the alliance against disinformation. So I think that might actually be, you know, we might have a global alliance of people who are defending truth, are defending transparency, defending pluralism, defending open debate, because I think that is what is important, and truth in democracy, truth in the institutions. And finally, and I come back to my initial issue, for us, I think it is key that the European Union grows up. I mean, really honestly, it's very frustrating. I mean, I'm neither anti-American nor anti-EU, very pro-EU, but I'm very frustrated to see how the EU is behaving. Like, you know, they're just going like, oh, we cannot handle the world. It's too scary. We don't know what to do. Well, grow up. You know, the European Union does need to become a political power, take its responsibility on the world stage, also in these matters. And we have to play a role. I mean, there are people out there in China, Hong Kong right now, in Iran, in Africa, you know, putting their trust in the European Union or indeed the United States as a mature democracy. Well, part of being a mature democracy is that you take responsibility as a democratic superpower, and, you know, the EU has to grow up fast.
Thank you, Sophie. Naja, I would like to move now back to you, especially when we are talking about taking responsibility and what the measures have been done, and come back actually to the point of Sophie earlier about legal definition of disinformation and the efforts that EU has been undertaking into certain regulation in this field. Could you perhaps touch upon that? What do you think about such definition or criteria norms that we should adopt to be more effective to counter disinformation?
Well, I think that the problem with the notion of fake news, for example, is that it's not really a term, so it's impossible to define. Disinformation, I think, is widely understood as information that has been manipulated with the intent to deceive. people, as opposed to misinformation that is just false information. So the intent is the criteria here, the criterion here. What was that was part of the question.
If you think that having a legal definition would be helpful, or having maybe certain types of norms and criteria which should be better defined in order to be able to address this information more effectively.
Do you mean globally, or do you mean in the European Union?
Perhaps in the European Union, from your point of view.
I think that is very difficult for me to say if it should be a legal definition. I think that we risk perhaps criticism of imposing, of playing the Ministry of Truth, and I think that might be risky. But I'm not a legal expert, so it's difficult for me to say.
That's fine, actually. Sophie, could you come back on that? I know you have something to share further.
Yes. Sorry to monopolize the time like this, but the point is that we're taking all sorts of measures, including like in Hungary, disinformation is being criminalized. People can go to jail. People have actually been arrested, and at the same time, we don't know what it is. And then, again, there is so much disinformation out there, including deliberate disinformation, lies with malicious intent. The question is, will it harm our society? Will it harm people? Or do we feel that our democracy is resilient enough, society is resilient enough to handle it? Because it's always been out there. I mean, I know politicians who deliberately promise a lot of nonsense, knowing that they're not going to deliver, for example, or knowing that it's not true. Journalists who claim things which are not true, but it doesn't scare us. And here we're very scared. We don't seem to have sufficient confidence in our own democracies and our own institutions. And I find if we are taking all these measures to protect our societies, then at the very least there should be a legal definition of what it is that we are fighting, what it is that we are going to make a legal offense or a criminal offense even. That's part of democracy, yeah?
Laura, would you like to share another point of view, or can we proceed to another question?
Sorry, I'm muted. Given that we only have 5 minutes, why don't we go ahead to another question?
So here's a very interesting question, talking about the intentions as well, and the impact. This is always very difficult to assess, but coming back to China's and Russia's efforts and their objectives, we have a question about China. The difference with China is that they seem to worry much more about their international image. And Russia is very satisfied with being able to solve further confusion and muddy the waters, and in sharing and spreading information on different topics from both sides or various sides to even increase this confusion. Could you perhaps touch upon, like, do you see they have these different objectives, their intentions, and have you also observed during this crisis that their tactics have changed or become similar in some ways? You already touched about the aggressive approach, but could you elaborate?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I agree with the distinction made there, at least historically. And I think, some of that comes from the fact that, geostrategically, China and Russia are situated very differently. China is an objectively rising power that is growing on, whether it's economic measures or growing in military strength or a whole host of different measures. I mean, we could talk about all the challenges that China faces too, internally, demographically, et cetera, but objectively is a rising power. Russia is an objectively declining power, and I think Putin is largely acting out of weakness in this space. So I do think that going along with those different interests, it certainly does have a greater interest in its own image externally, and in the image of the party, both externally and internally. Whereas Russia is much less focused on that. Some of that in our data, Russia and its information operations does very little talking about itself. it really doesn't actually talk about Russia in an external way, whereas much of China's content is about China itself. Now, the one thing I'll note is that we have certainly seen a shift in the COVID context, where alongside much more prolonged effort to promote a positive image of Beijing externally, we have seen this much more negative kind of destructive narrative effort, as well as very direct disinformation and information operations that are definitely aimed not so much at sort of the chaos and divisiveness that we've seen from Russia, but certainly much less about promoting this positive external image of China. And in fact, in some ways, those two strategies have clashed with one another. So in Italy, for instance, after promoting a lot of conversation about all the aid China was providing, a significant campaign around this hashtag about unity between China and Italy. We then saw state media, Chinese media, begin to push this disinformation narrative that maybe the virus actually originated, and did that by manipulating an interview with an Italian doctor. And so that really undercut the goodwill that had been building to some extent in Italy toward China. And so I think the real question is that sort of shift a sustained one, or is that happening in this moment because Beijing is so insecure about about covering up its own failings? And I think that remains to be seen.
Excellent. Naja, you also just recently published a few weeks ago an excellent briefing discussing the China and Russia's narratives and the amplification of them during the COVID-19. And as Laura just mentioned, there is a question of, are these efforts going to be sustained? And this maybe trend that we see now, is it going to be sustained? What do you expect? Do you think that the more assertive approach by China and adopting certain Russian toolkit is something that they will continue doing also after the current crisis?
Well, as I said, I think that the more under pressure they are, the more they have to sweep under the carpet, the more aggressive they will be. So I think that we don't know how the pandemic is going to play out. We're still in the middle of it. We don't know how it's going to develop. We know that the pandemic is already having severe consequences, economic and social, health, of course, health consequences. So I think it's hard to say, but I think that we can expect it to continue because there is a lot at stake, as I said.
So thank you, and we are running out of time. There are more questions that could be answered, which makes me pleased, because that means that there is interest in this topic and there will be more conversations that I'm sure that we will be holding on these issues. I'd like to thank all of our excellent speakers for sharing their perspectives from both sides of the Atlantic. Thank you very much for joining us. Also to everyone who has been watching and listening us on a Friday afternoon or morning, depending where you are. And I wish everyone an excellent weekend, and I hope to see you sometimes again. Goodbye.
Thanks so much.